October 8, 1943, flying 6,000 feet above the Dutch countryside. Flight Officer Ralph Hofer held tight to the control stick of his Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, his hands steady despite the fact that he'd been in actual combat for barely 20 minutes. The young man from Salem, Missouri, had grown up on farms and in boxing rings, never once imagining he'd fire weapons in anger from inside an aircraft. Through his oil-streaked windscreen, something caught his eye that made his pulse quicken. A German Messerschmitt 109 was tearing into an American fighter with brutal efficiency. Everything he'd been taught, everything his commanding officers had drilled into his head during training, rose up in his mind as one clear directive. Maintain formation, never chase a lone aircraft, protect your flight leader at all costs. But Ralph Hofer wasn't built to follow those rules. Something inside him, something forged in Missouri wheat fields and Chicago boxing rings, where he'd fought opponents and learned to absorb punishment, rejected those calculations entirely. He banked hard to the left, broke away from his flight, and dove. What he was about to do defied every doctrine in the book. Later that evening, when pilots at Royal Air Force Station Detton gathered to review his gun camera footage, veteran flyers who'd completed dozens of missions without ever firing their weapons sat in stunned silence. There on the screen was a Messerschmitt 109 filling the entire frame at point-blank range, absorbing devastating fire from his .850 caliber machine guns. The German fighter rolled, dove, and came apart in the sky. On his very first combat mission, the farm boy who'd never even fired a weapon from an aircraft before this moment had done the impossible. He'd scored a kill. Yet this was only the beginning of something far larger. Over the following 9 months, Ralph K. Hofer would destroy 30 German aircraft through flying tactics so reckless, so utterly lacking in discipline, yet so stunningly successful that his commanders held daily debates about whether to ground him or promote him. His aerial warfare statistics defied every military doctrine ever written. This young man who joined the Royal Canadian Air Force on nothing more than a whim would eventually become the 20th highest-scoring ace in the entire 8th Air Force. He would also become the second highest-scoring pilot killed in action. His extraordinary journey reveals something the military rarely wants to admit. Sometimes the greatest warriors succeed, not despite breaking every rule, but precisely because they break every single rule. June 22, 1921. Near Salem, Missouri, on a working farm. Ralph Halbrook was born into a world where flying remained little more than a distant fantasy for rural Americans. His father labored in a region where even automobiles were still considered remarkable novelties. The boy who would one day pilot the most advanced fighter aircraft in existence grew up surrounded by kerosene lamps rather than electricity, outhouses rather than indoor plumbing, with absolutely nothing to suggest that the vast sky overhead would ever become his domain. When Ralph turned 4 years old, his father passed away, his mother remarried, and the boy took his stepfather's surname, Hofer. That name would eventually appear in combat reports, intelligence briefings, and memorial services scattered across England. But in 1925, it belonged to nothing more than a Missouri farm boy learning to work hard ground, repair broken machinery, and endure the crushing depression that was settling over rural America. Athletics became his escape from the poverty that was swallowing up the entire region during the 1930s. He captured a trophy in the Golden Gloves boxing tournament, competing in the light heavyweight division in 1940. He played semi-professional football in Chicago leagues. His remarkable physical coordination, his quick reflexes, his ability to absorb hits and keep moving forward, all developed through years in boxing rings and on football fields rather than inside any classroom. The raw aggression that would later strike fear into German fighter pilots was sharpened against opponents in Chicago gyms, where his family had eventually settled. He even boxed professionally for a period under his birth name of Halbrook, sparring against legendary fighters like Billy Conn. By 1940, Ralph Hofer had completely abandoned any serious pursuit of formal education. He enrolled briefly in junior college, showing some passing interest in commercial art, but the rigid structure and rules felt stifling. He drifted back to Missouri, taking on civilian work at Fort Leonard Wood. His vague ambitions centered on heading to California to chase his dreams of becoming a professional prizefighter. Flying never even entered his thoughts. The path from aimless young drifter to combat pilot arrived completely by accident. In the fall of 1941, Hofer traveled north to Detroit, Michigan. He'd contracted to deliver a brand new 1942 Hudson automobile from the factory to a buyer somewhere on the West Coast, which would cover his travel costs. While he waited for the vehicle to be prepared, he took a day trip across the Detroit River into Windsor, Ontario. An immigration official, assuming this young American had crossed the border specifically to enlist for military service, directed him toward a Royal Canadian Air Force recruiting office. Hofer had never considered becoming a pilot. He'd never even been inside an aircraft. He possessed no technical training, no navigation experience, no understanding of how aerodynamics or ballistics actually worked. But the impulsive nature that defined his entire character took control. On July 19, 1941, just hours after crossing that border, he'd signed enlistment papers with the RCAF as an aviation cadet. The job delivering the Hudson automobile was forgotten. California and the boxing circuit vanished from his plans. The decision should have ended in complete disaster. Aviation training in 1941 demanded mathematical precision, technical knowledge, the ability to read complex instruments, and strict adherence to established procedures. Ralph Hofer possessed none of these qualities, yet somehow he managed to complete elementary flight training in Canada. He learned to control a basic aircraft. He passed navigation courses despite having absolutely no natural talent for the subject. He absorbed gunnery instruction without any previous experience firing weapons from the air. By October 1942, Sergeant Pilot Hofer was shipped across the Atlantic to Britain. The RCAF assigned him to additional training instead of active combat operations. Months drifted past. The war raged across Europe and North Africa. American forces had entered the fight after Pearl Harbor. Yet Hofer remained stuck in training units, watching the conflict from the sidelines, growing more and more frustrated with each passing week. In June 1943, a real opportunity finally appeared. The United States Army Air Forces started accepting transfer applications from American citizens serving in the RCAF. Hofer, with his accumulated flight hours and training credentials, qualified for immediate assignment to a combat squadron. On June 11, 1943, his transfer changed everything, converting his rank from sergeant pilot to flight officer, an unusual designation created specifically for non-commissioned pilots. More importantly, it put him on the direct path toward actual combat. But first came more intensive training. The Army Air Forces required every pilot to prove proficiency in the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, an enormous fighter weighing 5 tons when empty, powered by an 18-cylinder radial engine that generated 2,000 horsepower. The P-47 showed no mercy to careless or unprepared pilots. Its weight and raw power demanded respect, precision, and genuine skill. Hofer tackled it with his characteristic disregard for conventional wisdom. In September 1943, Flight Officer Hofer reported to Royal Air Force Station Detton in Essex, joining the 334th Fighter Squadron of the 4th Fighter Group under the 8th Air Force. He couldn't have joined a more storied unit if he'd specifically requested it. The 4th Fighter Group had been established on September 29, 1942, through a massive transfer of 3 Royal Air Force Eagle squadrons. These squadrons, numbered 71, 121, and 133, had consisted entirely of American volunteers who'd crossed into Canada to join the fight before the United States entered the war. The Eagles brought their own distinctive culture into the Army Air Forces. Independent by nature, aggressive to the point of extreme recklessness, openly scornful of peacetime military discipline, they'd built their reputations flying Supermarine Spitfires over France and the English Channel. Their transition into American command structure did nothing to diminish their rebellious attitudes. The 4th Fighter Group became famous as the most individualistic, most aggressive, most successful fighter unit in the entire 8th Air Force. Into this already volatile environment walked Ralph Hofer, carrying his own particular brand of chaos. With his notably long brown hair violating military grooming standards, his bright blue football jersey bearing the number 78 in orange numerals, his gold snake ring worn prominently on his left hand, he looked far more like a college athlete than a military pilot. Throughout the base, people often spotted him with Duke, an Alsatian dog he'd adopted from a pilot who'd bailed out over France. According to those who witnessed it, Hofer occasionally took Duke on local flights, crouching down to create the appearance of the dog sitting at the controls when passing other aircraft. He'd leave his parachute behind to create extra space inside the cockpit. His unusual appearance was merely the surface expression of something much deeper. Hofer treated military discipline the way he approached everything else, with cheerful indifference. Military police arrested him in London for failing to wear rank insignia properly. During that arrest, they discovered he wasn't carrying required identification documents. His dress uniform blouse had been tailored in an exaggerated zoot suit style, a fashion associated with jazz musicians rather than military personnel. Everything about him suggested someone who would wash out of combat aviation within a matter of weeks. Then October 8, 1943 arrived. The 4th Fighter Group scrambled to escort Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress bombers attacking targets near Bremen, Germany. Hofer flew as wingman to Captain James A. Clark, a veteran Eagle Squadron pilot, in a borrowed P-47 Thunderbolt marked with the code QPG. His assignment was straightforward: stay in formation, cover his flight leader, scan for enemy fighters, do not engage unless absolutely necessary, do not break formation under any circumstances. Over the Netherlands, German fighters attacked. Messerschmitt 109s dove from above, forcing the American formation to scatter and break apart. Hofer's Thunderbolt flicked and spun downward, pulling out west of Zwolle. When he regained control, he found himself alone at low altitude, completely separated from his flight, lost above enemy territory on his very first combat mission. The correct response would have been to climb, use landmarks and the sun's position to orient himself and head west toward England at maximum speed. Hofer ignored the textbook entirely. Flying low across the Dutch countryside, he spotted a Messerschmitt 109 pursuing another P-47. He could see tracers coming from the German fighter as the pilot pressed his attack. The P-47 turned right and dove from 1,000 feet, clearly doomed. Hofer reacted purely on instinct rather than training. He closed on the Messerschmitt at full throttle, accelerating to attack speed. The 109 pilot remained completely focused on his target and never saw the threat approaching from behind him. At 100 yards, Hofer opened fire. 850 caliber machine guns converged their fire onto the German fighter. Strikes and flashes erupted all along the fuselage. Oil sprayed backward, coating Hofer's windscreen in a thick layer. The Messerschmitt 109 rolled over and dove straight down. Hofer had to shove his control stick forward forcefully to avoid ramming the enemy aircraft. By the time he pulled out of the dive, oil had completely obscured his forward vision. He headed west toward the coast at 300 feet, effectively flying blind. His adventure was far from finished. A half-mile offshore, a small German patrol vessel opened fire on him. Hofer, with almost no forward visibility and running low on ammunition, fired several short bursts at it before turning toward England. He landed at Debton hours later, one of the final aircraft to return. Ground crew immediately noticed something unusual about his plane. The protective tape that armors placed over the gun muzzles to keep them clean had been broken. This new pilot had actually fired his weapons on his first mission, an extraordinarily rare occurrence. When Hofer reported to his intelligence officer and described what he'd done, veteran pilots gathered to examine his gun camera footage with profound skepticism. Brand new pilots simply did not score kills during their first missions. The numbers didn't support it. Most pilots flew dozens of sorties before even seeing an enemy aircraft clearly enough to shoot at. The film began to roll across the screen. There was a Messerschmitt 109 filling the entire frame at close range, absorbing absolutely devastating fire. Strikes marched up the fuselage in sequence. The canopy shattered into fragments. Pieces peeled away from the airframe. The aircraft rolled upside down and dove out of view. The thing that seemed impossible had actually happened. The farm boy from Missouri had managed a kill on his very first combat mission by deliberately breaking every rule he'd been taught. Over the next 4 months, Hofer flew regular missions without scoring any additional victories. On February 6, 1944, he brought down another Messerschmitt 109 over France. Then his personal victory count began to climb with alarming rapidity. Between his second confirmed kill and the end of May 1944, Hofer would destroy 28 more German aircraft. His flying tactics evolved in a direction that horrified his commanding officers, while simultaneously producing results that couldn't be denied. March 18, 1944, the 4th Fighter Group escorted bombers attacking Munich. The unit had recently traded in its P-47 Thunderbolts for North American P-51 Mustangs, sleek long-range fighters that would eventually become the most iconic American aircraft of the entire war. Hofer was assigned to fly number 4 position in White Flight of the 334th Squadron. Number 4 meant he was the wingman's wingman, the most junior position within a 4-ship formation. His role was simple: maintain formation. Do not engage independently. Over Bavaria, Hofer spotted a Messerschmitt 109 below the formation. Without a radio call, without any warning to his flight leader, he split away and dove. The 109 pilot never understood what was happening. 50 caliber rounds tore through the fuselage. The German fighter crashed in a massive fireball. Hofer pulled up, searching for his flight. They were already far ahead, completely unaware they'd lost their number 4 position pilot. As he climbed to rejoin them, Hofer spotted another Messerschmitt 109 in the distance. He pushed the throttle forward and accelerated into pursuit. The German pilot caught sight of the American fighter bearing down on him and made an instant decision. He'd had enough. Rather than risk a dogfight, he ejected from his cockpit and bailed out. Suddenly, Hofer found himself flying solo, hundreds of miles deep inside enemy territory, with a radio that had gone completely dead. No way to call for help, no way to coordinate with the other Americans. The logical thing would have been to point his nose toward England and head straight home. Hofer did no such thing. He decided to hunt for more targets instead. Below him stretched German airspace, full of possibilities. He spotted an airfield and began circling it, searching for anything worth shooting at. Then he picked up another Messerschmitt 109 and gave chase, but the German pilot dove into clouds and vanished. Frustrated but not discouraged, Hofer changed direction toward Munich, thinking he might reconnect with his squadron near the original target zone. As he flew that way, 2 more 109s appeared ahead and slightly above him, passing through the sky. Every textbook on fighter tactics would have screamed one word at him: no. 2 German fighters against 1 American, hundreds of miles from friendly territory, fuel running low, radio completely useless. The math didn't work. The odds pointed toward a coffin. Hofer shoved the throttle to the stops and climbed after them at full power. That's when disaster struck. His Mustang's propeller pitch control suddenly failed. The propeller blades lost their bite. They spun uselessly against the air, unable to grip it properly. The engine howled like a wounded animal. Revolutions per minute climbed into the red zone. The whole aircraft shuddered and bucked violently. His airspeed began bleeding away as the propeller became nothing more than a spinning weight dragging him down. For the first time that day, Hofer's mind turned to survival. He knew Switzerland wasn't far. The Swiss kept their country neutral, and they honored that neutrality by interning pilots from both sides who managed to reach their territory. It wasn't freedom, but it meant living. He nosed the crippled Mustang downward in a gentle glide, pointing toward the Swiss border and the Alps beyond. When he crossed into Swiss airspace, he began the bailout sequence. His hand reached up and released the canopy, preparing to jump clear of the cockpit. Then something extraordinary happened. The propeller pitch control corrected itself, just like that. The propeller blades suddenly caught air again and began working the way they were supposed to. The engine settled from a scream into a steady roar. Power returned, the aircraft responded. There he sat in an open cockpit, the wind rushing past his face, Swiss mountains stretching below him, and somehow, impossibly, the Mustang was flying properly again. He did some quick mental math about his fuel consumption and the distance to England. If the numbers held and his luck continued, he just might make it. He pushed the stick forward and leveled out, setting course northwest at maximum speed. The open cockpit turned into a wind tunnel. Cold cut right through his flight suit as he climbed back to altitude. The cold was brutal, but not nearly as dangerous as running out of fuel. Below him, the German landscape gave way to the darker waters ahead. The English Channel opened up beneath his wings. Then came the white cliffs, and Kent spreading out below like a welcome mat. Hofer brought the wounded Mustang down at Manston, an emergency landing field on the Kent coast that existed specifically for damaged aircraft limping back from Germany. When the ground crew climbed up to check his fuel tanks, they found exactly 6 gallons sloshing around in the bottom. 6 gallons. That was it. A Mustang burned 50 gallons per hour in normal cruising flight. He'd flown all that way on fumes alone, on nothing but luck and willpower. And he'd done it after destroying 2 enemy fighters by himself while flying deep in the heart of Germany, completely separated from his own forces. The mission made him an ace, 5 confirmed victories, and still holding the rank of flight officer, one of the junior members of the entire fighter group's pilot roster. His commanders faced a real problem. Hofer's complete disregard for formation flying and basic tactical doctrine put other pilots in danger. His habit of diving into fights alone, against any odds, violated everything the fighter pilot's manual taught. It went against every principle of coordinated group combat, but he kept coming back with victories. The gun camera film from his aircraft proved each claim beyond argument. Intelligence couldn't dispute what the cameras recorded. Through the spring of 1944, his confirmed kills kept climbing. By the end of March, he'd added a Focke-Wulf 190 to his tally. April brought 5 more enemy aircraft crashing to earth under his guns. On April 22nd, the Army finally promoted him from flight officer to second lieutenant. It didn't change how he flew one bit. Then came the last 10 days of May 1944. A stretch of aerial combat so intense, so remarkable in its success, that it seemed almost unreal. Hofer claimed 14 German aircraft destroyed during those 10 days, a mix of aerial kills and ground strafing attacks, 14 victories in 10 days. Most pilots never achieved that many during an entire combat tour. On May 23, 1944, they promoted him again, this time to first lieutenant. 3 days later, on May 26, he shot down 2 more Focke-Wulf 190s in the sky. Then on May 29, he destroyed 5 Heinkel 177s while strafing a German airfield. 4 were confirmed as his alone, with 1 shared credit going to another pilot. Those ground victories came from low-level attacks on heavily defended German bases, where anti-aircraft fire filled the air with so much flak that American fighters fell regularly. Hofer pressed his attacks at minimum altitude, his guns blazing continuously, pulling up through explosions that shredded other aircraft into pieces. On June 2, 1944, they made him flight commander of a flight within the 334th Squadron. Now he held actual responsibility for other pilots. The undisciplined pilot, who'd broken every rule in the book, was suddenly supposed to maintain formation and enforce tactical discipline. His reputation for radio chatter matched his reckless flying. Where other pilots maintained radio silence or used brief professional calls, Hofer's voice was constantly filling the frequency with commentary. His most memorable transmission came during a mission over the Alps. While his fellow pilots concentrated on navigation and watching for threats, Hofer keyed his microphone and offered his observation to everyone listening. "Gee, ain't the Alps pretty?" June 6, 1944 arrived. D-Day. The beaches of Normandy filled with Allied soldiers, making the largest amphibious assault in history. The 4th Fighter Group flew multiple missions that day, protecting the bombers and hitting German positions on the ground. On his second sortie that evening, Hofer led his blue flight from 334 Squadron when they spotted a German convoy moving along a road in Normandy. They dove to attack, guns firing at the vehicles below. None of them saw the danger above. A large force of Messerschmitt 109s came diving down on blue flight, while the American pilots were focused entirely on ground targets. The fighting was vicious and quick. 3 of the 4 Mustangs went down in seconds, smoking and falling. Only Hofer got away. He broke hard, dove for the deck, and vanished into the gathering darkness. Once again, pilots around him died while Hofer survived. 5 days later, on June 11th, small arms fire from the ground found his P-51 while he was flying over France. The damage was severe enough that he couldn't nurse the aircraft any farther. He made an emergency landing on a temporary airstrip carved out of the invasion beachhead by Allied engineers. He climbed out without a scratch. Later that same day, he hitched a ride back to Debden in another aircraft, bringing back souvenirs he'd picked up, a German helmet and a German military magazine. Late June 1944 brought new orders. The 4th Fighter Group was tasked with Operation Frantic, a complex shuttle bombing mission that would send American heavy bombers from English bases toward targets near Berlin, then continue eastward to land at Soviet bases deep in Ukraine. Colonel Don Blakely, commanding the 4th Fighter Group, would lead 68 Mustangs from the 4th and 350th Fighter Groups to escort the bombers. Blakely decided to ground Hofer for this particular mission. The reason was straightforward. Hofer refused to get vaccinated, even though vaccinations were mandatory for anyone entering Soviet territory. Blakely pushed further, banning him from the officers' club. Only when Hofer finally gave in and accepted the shots did Blakely clear him to fly the mission. On June 21, 1944, at 7:28 in the morning, Colonel Blakely led the escort flight north from Debden. The formation climbed steadily, rendezvoused with 144 B-17s, and set course toward Berlin and eastern Germany. Before departure, Blakely had given his pilots detailed instructions about avoiding combat with German fighters if at all possible. Any pilot who had to jettison drop tanks before reaching Berlin would run short on fuel for the nearly 1,500-mile journey to Ukraine. The message was unmistakable. Stay with the formation, follow the plan, don't break away. The flight proceeded without major incident as they crossed into Germany and Poland. Over western Poland, a Mustang and a B-17 were lost during a brief encounter with Focke-Wulf 190s. Hofer predictably became separated during the fighting. The main formation continued eastward and picked its way carefully over unfamiliar terrain into Ukraine. Blakely's navigation proved exceptional. The P-51 squadrons arrived at Poltava exactly on schedule. In front of Soviet officers and dignitaries watching from the ground, Blakely and his pilots taxied into position and cut their engines. When they counted the aircraft, the results were grim. All but 2 Mustangs had made it. The missing aircraft belonged to Lieutenant Ralph K. Hofer. What actually happened to Hofer only emerged later. He'd become separated during the brief dogfight, but continued flying eastward alone. Navigation had never been his strength. His judgment on this occasion proved particularly poor. He landed without permission at a Soviet airfield near Kiev, where suspicious Soviet military authorities immediately took him into protective custody. They held him there for 4 days while they verified through proper channels that he was actually an American pilot and not some elaborate hoax. By June 26, the shuttle force took off from Soviet bases, hit targets across Eastern Europe, and continued on toward Italy. Once the Soviets finally released him, Hofer followed behind several days later with 2 other pilots whose aircraft had mechanical problems requiring repair. During the flight toward Italy, one of the other pilots suggested to Hofer that his heading wasn't quite right. Hofer, displaying his usual supreme confidence in his navigation abilities despite having no real talent for it, insisted he was on the correct course. The 2 other pilots decided to follow a different heading. One made it to the intended Italian base, the other ended up landing in Sicily, far from his target. Hofer's fuel situation deteriorated as he flew. Eventually, he spotted a flight of British aircraft and decided to follow them. That decision brought him down at Malta, hundreds of miles off his intended course. 5 days passed before he rejoined his group in Italy. On July 2, 1944, Blakely volunteered his Mustangs as additional fighter escort for bombers from the 15th Air Force attacking Budapest, Hungary. The force launched from Foggia, Italy, and climbed to altitude on a northward heading. Over Budapest, they encountered a large formation of Messerschmitt 109s waiting for them. What followed was a savage aerial brawl. Captain George Stanford of the 335th Squadron was leading his flight with Hofer assigned as his wingman. Early in the engagement, Stanford's luck turned bad. His drop tanks refused to jettison, and then his engine threw a piston rod. Without power, he had no choice. He broke away and dropped toward lower altitude, knowing he'd never make it back to Italy. Stanford brought his crippled Mustang down in a Hungarian wheat field and was immediately captured. As he stood near the wreckage, something caught his eye. A single P-51 came screaming in low over the field, flying just above the grain. Stanford recognized it immediately as Hofers' aircraft. His wingman had followed him down to see if he was all right. Then Stanford's heart sank. Behind Hofer, positioned perfectly in his 6 o'clock, sat a Messerschmitt 109. The German fighter opened fire just before both aircraft disappeared from view. Seconds later, Stanford heard the crash and the silence that followed. When the 4th Fighter Group returned to Italy that afternoon, 6 Mustangs were missing. Ralph Hofer was among them. When he didn't show up by the next day, there was no avoiding the conclusion. They had to officially log him as missing in action. Weeks later came word through Red Cross channels. Hofer's body had been found in the wreckage of his P-51 near Mostar in what was then Yugoslavia, several hundred miles south of Budapest. The exact circumstances of his death remained a mystery for many decades. The truth came together slowly over 50 years. Stanford's account, which became public in the 1990s, provided the first real clue. It confirmed that Hungarian pilot Ensign Laszlo Kruzik, flying Messerschmitt 109s for the 101st Puma Regiment, had claimed an American P-51 on July 2, 1944. Kruzik himself was killed on July 26, 1944, while attacking 15th Air Force bombers headed toward Austria. His claim aligned with what Stanford had witnessed, but it didn't explain why Hofer's body was found near Mostar, 300 miles south of Budapest. The complete story finally emerged in 2003 when aviation historian Troy White published his detailed biography. Through extensive research into German and Yugoslav military records, White determined that Hofer hadn't been shot down by an enemy fighter pilot at all. Ground fire from the German-operated airfield at Mostar had brought him down. White's research suggests that Hofer may have been initially attacked and possibly damaged by Kruzik, exactly as Stanford had witnessed. Whether Hofer was attempting an emergency landing at the German airfield or, staying true to his reckless character, intended to strafe it despite the damage, this remains unknown. What was certain was that Ralph Hofer, the most undisciplined pilot in the 4th Fighter Group, had finally run out of luck. The records are clear on what happened to the flak unit stationed at Mostar. A P-51 came screaming down at low altitude, struck by anti-aircraft fire from the 4 Battery, Flat Regiment 9 of the Legion Condor. The fighter smashed directly into one of the airfield's gun emplacements at around noon on July 2, 1944. 2 gunners died instantly in the impact. A third lay injured among the wreckage. When they recovered the American pilot's body, identification came quickly. First Lieutenant Ralph K. Hofer, 334 Fighter Squadron, 4th Fighter Group, United States Army Air Forces. He was flying a borrowed P-51, the B model, marked with the tail code QPX. Just 23 years old, having celebrated that birthday only 10 days before. Behind him lay a combat record that defied belief. 74 missions flown. 30 German aircraft destroyed. 15 of those kills came in dogfights high above Europe. Another 15 fell to his guns during low-level strafing runs across hostile territory. The decorations accumulated accordingly. A Distinguished Flying Cross with 3 oak leaf clusters. An Air Medal with 3 oak leaf clusters. The Purple Heart for wounds received. Campaign medals with 3 bronze stars marking his service across multiple theaters. His final resting place is Section 79 at Jefferson Barracks National Cemetery in St. Louis, Missouri. Graves 254 through 256 hold what remains of Hofer and other American servicemen whose individual identities could not be separated. He ranked among the highest-scoring aces of the entire 8th Air Force. He was the second most accomplished fighter pilot from that command to die in action. But statistics cannot measure what men like Hofer meant to the Germans who faced them. By spring of 1944, the Luftwaffe was hemorrhaging pilots at a rate it could never sustain. American fighters appeared over German airspace in such overwhelming numbers that survival itself seemed impossible. German pilots found themselves forced to engage opponents who showed no hesitation, who dove into combat without calculation or fear. They had learned to expect coordinated attacks, disciplined formations, careful tactical coordination. Then came pilots like Hofer who discarded all of that entirely. These men did not simply protect the bombers or respond when challenged. They hunted. They deliberately broke formation to chase individual enemy fighters deep into German territory, pursuing them across hostile landscapes. They attacked airfields defended by flak batteries with a disregard for personal safety that seemed almost suicidal to observers. German pilots trained in rigid formations and precise tactical coordination struggled to comprehend such behavior. They misread it as tactical brilliance when it was actually something far more primal. Hofer and pilots like him were not following American doctrine at all. They were actively rejecting it. The official doctrine emphasized maintaining formation integrity, mutual support among wingmen, coordinated attacks against superior numbers, and careful management of risk. Hofer's approach stood at the exact opposite pole: individual aggression, opportunistic engagement at any odds, acceptance of extreme risk, complete indifference to coordination or formation discipline. The 4th Fighter Group produced more aces than any other unit in the 8th Air Force. 81 pilots achieved ace status, each confirming at least 5 victories. Their combined kills exceeded 1,000 enemy aircraft. Within this elite cadre of exceptional pilots, Hofer stood apart as the most individualistic, the most aggressive, the most undisciplined. Colonel Don Blakely commanded the 4th Fighter Group and flew 490 missions himself without ever being shot down. He viewed Hofer with conflicted emotions. Blakely demanded aggression and rewarded results. He loathed sloppiness and despised indiscipline. Hofer embodied everything Blakely despised about military chaos while delivering precisely the victories Blakely desired. Their relationship festered with tension. Blakely grounded Hofer repeatedly. He stripped him of privileges. Yet he kept authorizing combat missions because Hofer kept returning with confirmed kills. Major James Goodson flew with the 4th Fighter Group and scored 20 victories of his own, 15 in aerial combat, and another 15 through strafing. He wrote extensively about Hofer in his memoir, 2 Miles in the Clouds, describing the young pilot with a mixture of fondness and profound exasperation. The passage Goodson devoted to the scene at Debton when Hofer failed to return from one mission reportedly moved readers to tears. The contrast between Hofer and other successful aces proves instructive. Captain Walker Bud Mahurin scored 19.75 victories in Europe through methodical discipline. He maintained formation integrity throughout every engagement. He coordinated with his wingmen. He managed fuel carefully and flew with calculated precision. Mahurin survived the war, volunteered for combat again in Korea, was shot down, captured, survived the prison camps, and retired as a colonel. Major George Preddy became the highest-scoring ace in the 8th Air Force, with 26.83 confirmed victories. He blended aggression with tactical precision in a way that seemed impossible. He led flights effectively while protecting bombers. He managed risk without avoiding danger. Preddy died in December 1944 when American anti-aircraft gunners mistakenly shot down his P-51 during a low-level pursuit of German fighters. Hofer embodied the opposite extreme. Formation discipline meant nothing to him. He separated from his flight intentionally to hunt alone. He engaged at any odds without calculation or hesitation. He pressed attacks even when escape was the only logical choice. His tactics should have gotten him killed in his first month of combat. Instead, he survived 9 months, scored 30 victories, and became a legend. Historians continue debating whether Hofer succeeded because of his tactics or despite them. His maximum aggression and unpredictability created opportunities that more cautious pilots never encountered. When Hofer broke formation to chase enemy aircraft, German pilots were not expecting a lone American fighter. When he pressed attacks at close range, enemy pilots panicked rather than fought effectively. The opposing argument suggests that Hofer succeeded through luck and natural ability, that his tactics should have killed him, but exceptional skill kept him alive. His situational awareness sustained him when outnumbered and alone. His gunnery killed quickly before counterattacks developed. His aircraft handling enabled escape from situations that trapped other pilots. The truth probably incorporated both elements. His natural aggression and exceptional skill created opportunities. His extraordinary luck allowed him to survive long enough to exploit them. His tactics maximized immediate success while guaranteeing eventual death. Hofer was always going to die in combat. The only question involved how many enemy aircraft he would destroy before that death arrived. His squadron mates experienced complex emotions when he was killed, relief mixed with grief. The constant explanations to angry commanders would cease. The absences that created chaos would end. Yet they had also lost a friend and respected his achievements. The young pilot who wore football jerseys on flights, who flew with his dog Duke on local missions, who commented on alpine scenery during combat, was gone. American war correspondents had built Hofer into a hero in the months preceding his death. Virginia Irwin's detailed profile appeared in the St. Louis Post-Dispatch in June 1944, capturing his personality with precision. She portrayed a young man uncomfortable with hero worship but aware of his own success. When asked about being celebrated for liberating conquered peoples, Hofer said he would go red from embarrassment. When asked about his success as a fighter pilot, he dismissed it as just one of those things. After his death, tributes appeared in newspapers across Missouri. The local boy who had drifted through Depression-era jobs, who joined the Canadian Air Force on impulse, who flew 74 combat missions while violating every rule, became a symbol of American fighting spirit and individual initiative. Hofer's legend expanded across the decades following the war. Aviation historians researching 4th Fighter Group records found his story repeatedly. Gun camera footage survived in archives. After-action reports revealed a pilot who engaged enemy aircraft with shocking frequency. His personnel file documented constant disciplinary problems alongside exceptional combat results. He became a case study in the eternal tension between military discipline and combat effectiveness. Modern fighter pilots studying historical aces inevitably encounter Hofer. His story generates debate in every ready room where it is discussed. Some pilots see him as inspiration, proof that aggression and individual initiative can overcome doctrine. Others see him as a cautionary tale, a skilled pilot whose indiscipline ensured early death. Both interpretations hold validity. Hofer's broader significance concerns the nature of warfare itself. Military organizations exist to coordinate large-scale violence through systematic doctrine. Success requires coordination, mutual support, adherence to plans. Yet warfare also rewards individual initiative, aggression, and the willingness to exploit fleeting opportunities. Hofer operated at the extreme edge of tolerable individualism. His commanders permitted him to operate because he produced results. Had he served in a unit with less aggressive traditions, he would have been permanently grounded. The 4th Fighter Group provided exactly the right environment for Hofer to thrive. A unit aggressive enough to appreciate his kills, but disciplined enough to function despite his presence. The 30 victories he scored carried costs beyond his own death. Other pilots died covering for his absences. Formations weakened when he broke away. Missions became more dangerous. Commanders spent countless hours managing the chaos he created. From a purely mathematical perspective, each German aircraft destroyed represented one less threat to American bombers. By mid-1944, Germany could not replace losses in either aircraft or experienced pilots. Every kill mattered. Yet from a systemic perspective, if every pilot in the 4th Fighter Group had operated like Hofer, the unit would have disintegrated entirely. Formation escorts would have collapsed. Bombers would have gone unprotected. Casualties would have soared catastrophically. The success of aggressive individual pilots depended on the majority flying disciplined formations. Hofer succeeded because he was exceptional. The 4th Fighter Group's approach proved pragmatic. They tolerated his indiscipline because he produced results while containing the damage his behavior caused. They grounded him temporarily when his actions endangered others too directly. They promoted him reluctantly when his successes demanded recognition. They never resolved the fundamental tension between his value and his chaos. They managed it until he died. Other military organizations face similar challenges with exceptional performers who refuse or cannot conform. Special operations units partially solve this problem by creating environments where aggressive individualism is expected rather than merely tolerated. Fighter squadrons lack that luxury. They must maintain discipline while exploiting individual talent. On July 2, 1944, a farm boy from Missouri, who should never have become a pilot, who joined the Air Force on impulse, who flew 74 combat missions while breaking every rule, who destroyed 30 German aircraft through pure aggression, flew into anti-aircraft fire at a Yugoslav airfield and died. He was 23 years old. He left behind a mother in Colorado, friends back home, a dog named Duke, and a reputation that would perplex military historians for decades. The 4th Fighter Group continued operations through May 1945. By war's end, they had destroyed over 1,000 German aircraft in aerial combat and ground strafing combined. 81 pilots achieved ace status within that unit. They became the most successful fighter group in the 8th Air Force by virtually every metric. Within that remarkable organization, Ralph Hofer remained unique. Not the highest-scoring ace, not the most skilled pilot, not the most decorated, simply the most aggressive, most undisciplined, most individualistic fighter pilot in a unit renowned for producing aggressive, individualistic fighter pilots. His tactics should have killed him in weeks. Instead, he survived 9 months and destroyed 30 German aircraft by refusing to fly the way he was trained. That may be the most important lesson his story offers. Military organizations train individuals to operate in systematic, coordinated ways. Most of the time, this approach produces optimal results. But occasionally, individuals emerge who succeed by rejecting the system entirely. These exceptional people create problems for command structures while delivering exceptional results. The 4th Fighter Group chose to tolerate Ralph Hofer until he died. They could not tame him. They could not replicate him. They could not fully understand him. They could only watch in amazement as a farm boy from Missouri who wore football jerseys and flew with his dog, destroyed German aircraft at a rate that defied all doctrine, until anti-aircraft fire over Yugoslavia ended his brief violent career. His story stands as testimony to a truth military organizations rarely acknowledge. Sometimes the greatest warriors succeed, not despite breaking every rule, but because they break every rule. Ralph Hofer was not a good soldier. He was a brilliant fighter. In war, that distinction matters more than any regulation he violated.